Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, exploring how to go about recovering American ideals with author Todd Gitlin. I'm Alan Wolf, and I direct the Bosse Center for Religion and Public Life at Boston College. I was intrigued to hear from Pat's remarks that this is the 41st winter that the Cambridge Forum has been going on. 41 years is a little bit longer than I've known Todd Gitlin, but not by all that much. We met at a time when we really didn't have winters. We were both living in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. We knew that we had a lot of common interests then, and our common interests have intertwined ever since. Among other common interests, we both left the Bay Area to come to the East Coast. I think I can say for myself, and I'm sure I can say for Todd, it was a great move in both cases. Todd's going to talk about his book, The Bulldozer and the Big Tent, Blind Republicans, Lame Democrats, and the Recovery of American Ideals. I'm very curious to see what he has to say, since as of today, the Bulldozer has withdrawn from the Republican nomination for president. It remains to be seen how big the tent is, but the withdrawal of John Edwards suggests that our next nominee will be, in the Democratic Party, reflective of the larger tent in American life that includes the voices of women and African Americans. So this is an enormously important time to discuss this book that is so interesting and so informative and so much a guide to the thickets of the current political race and indeed of the future that the country we all share. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Todd. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Alan. Thank all of you. It's a pleasure to be back in Harvard Square, where I spent a number of damp and rewarding January nights. You will already hear that I'm nasally impacted, and there's nothing I can do about it. I chose to keep myself chemical-free, hoping it might give me an extra wit or two, but I hope I'm not incomprehensible as a result. It is indeed a promising and if not exhilarating, at least auspicious moment in our possible revival as a republic. And what I think I want to do is, instead of walking through the great labyrinth of all the arguments that make up a book, to focus on one element of the argument that I think is very much apropos our current situation. And maybe this helps deepen our sense of where we are in the political landscape of the last half century. One of my concerns for a long time, and it came to a head during these traumatic Bush years, was with a key element in contemporary politics that I think doesn't get sufficient attention. And it has to do with the relation between the two necessary components of a political tendency. Those two political components are movements and parties. And I suppose my big claim is that power and the ability to affect the course of history depends on the ability of a tendency to get that relationship right. Now, movements and parties are in many ways very different kinds of creatures. And in some ways, you might think they were actually counterposed. And certainly, on the face of them, they look extremely different. Movements are unruly. Parties are organized. Movements tend to be made up of amateurs. Parties tend to be made up of professionals. Movements tend to be episodic. Parties tend to be institutionalized. And so, not surprisingly, the problem of how to get these two quite different instruments in some sort of harness so they work together rather than at cross purposes, this is a difficult venture. And my starting claim on that ground is that the Republican Party solved this problem for itself, or I should say the Republican Party and the so-called movement conservatives began to work on this problem in the late 1950s, came to a resolution of it in the mid-1960s, and have fattened on their success since. And while they were perfecting that relationship, while they were working out that reconciliation, the left, center, liberals failed to make that reconciliation. And now we see another adventure in whether they will succeed in making up for a great deal of lost time. This, by the way, may or may not seem to you as a rather esoteric, sort of political science-y, technical question, but it's striking to me how it keeps cropping up in the current campaign. Not so many weeks ago, I lose track in the middle of this political cycle, and I don't think it was more than maybe 3 weeks ago, there was one of these interesting news bursts within the Democratic campaign. Hillary Clinton said something to the following effect. She said that we should remember that, it must have been on the occasion of Martin Luther King's birthday. We should remember that while Martin Luther King, of course, was a great man, in order to complete the passage of civil rights legislation, it was necessary that there be a president, Lyndon Johnson, who was able to accomplish what the previous president, John Kennedy, had not succeeded in completing, and what, in fact, his predecessor hadn't even tried to complete, namely the conversion of the energies of the civil rights movement into legislation. And then you remember, for saying that, she was quite roundly hammered by a number of supporters of Barack Obama. Now, if you're curious, I'll tell you where I am with relation to these figures, but my purpose in bringing this up is not to take a side. My purpose in bringing this up is to point out that what Hillary Clinton said was absolutely unexceptionable. It was the literal historical truth. It's undeniable that to achieve the Civil Rights Act, there had to be not only the movement, of which Martin Luther King was a distinct leader, but also a political system that was prepared to capitalize on and encourage and consolidate the energies that were released in that movement in order to create legislation. Absolutely no denial of this. The fact that it became controversial was, I think, not only a marker of the vexations and perturbations of a political campaign, but also suggests that there's something in our general understanding of politics that is wanting. It should not have been a controversial remark. It is actually a wise observation about how politics games. 2 plus 2 is 4, regardless of who says it, and regardless of whether you're on the side of the first two or the second two. The Republican Party, I suggest, the Republican Party and the movement conservatives solved their related problem, began to solve it in the late 1950s and were well on their way to solving it by the mid-1960s, although it took another decade for them to consolidate what they began to work out then. And the moment of truth, the early moments of truth for the movement conservatives come when, in the late 1950s, they begin to organize around local issues at a time when they feel themselves to be completely marginal in American politics. They are vigorous anti-communists. They are deeply anti-statist. They hate the government. They think, in fact, that the government of the time is a ramification of a communist conspiracy. I'm speaking here of the John Birch Society, the best known of these groups, but they were not only ranters out in the margins, they were dedicated workers in behalf of converting a major political party into the extension of their approach to the world. And beginning in Orange County, California, and mushrooming out into the rest of Southern California. They succeeded after a number of years of organizing in becoming a force within that very important Republican Party. At a time when, as I said, they believed that the Republican Party itself had fallen into the hands of the devil. Dwight Eisenhower was a dedicated member, according to their leader, of the international communist conspiracy. I'm not making this up. He lived right over in the suburbs here. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, he said that. I don't think it, no, Welsh, no, different grapes. Welsh grapes. On the strength of their early victories in local campaigns, they felt strong enough in 1962 to run a candidate in the gubernatorial primary for the Republican nomination. And they had a prefiguration of today's talk show hosts, a right-wing, successful right-wing fellow from Southern California. And they ran him in the California primary, and to their chagrin, they were defeated. He was defeated by the moderate Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. And at that moment, this is 1962, they felt a crisis of approach. They were still very much, in the terms I'm using here, a movement. They were principled, they were uncompromising, they were fierce, they were dedicated, they were amateurs, and they felt they'd been betrayed by the party bosses and the establishment and the insiders. And at that moment, they doubted the applicability of this strategy of taking over the Republican Party, and they actually considered bolting and establishing a third party. And during this phase, they went to their prime funder, a man named Walter Knott, who ran Knott's Berry Farm. And they put this proposition to him, well, we tried to work through the system, and we've just been ushered out of the room. And so we want to leave the Republican Party, and we want you to support our effort to do that. And he said, in effect, forget it. The political system is so constituted as to make third parties a waste of time as anything other than spoilers. So roll up your sleeves, get back to work, and God be with you. Within 2 years, they had been, and so they took that advice, being people who listened to their bankers, and being a rather orderly crowd. They believe in hierarchy. They took his advice. They went back to work. By 1964, they were in charge of the Republican Party of California, and were able to play an important part in the much larger movement of conservatives to nominate Barry Goldwater, which, as you know, they succeeded in doing in 1964. And then, on the heels of his landslide defeat, a phoenix rose from those ashes in the form of Ronald Reagan, who, in a more, as we would say today, user-friendly fashion, was able to soften some of the edges around the Goldwater imagery and to become a compelling political leader. If we flash forward then, after Reagan's victory in the gubernatorial race in California in 1966, flash forward to the post-Nixon period when the Republican Party was up for grabs again, when Ronald Reagan made his second attempt at a presidential run. In 1976, when he went up against the then incumbent Vice President Gerald Ford, or incumbent unelected president, I should say, Gerald Ford, and came very close to winning. There was an interesting moment of truth in early 1977 when Ronald Reagan gave a speech in which he acknowledged the problem that conservatives had in making the Republican Party a useful, a serviceable vehicle for their purposes. He gave a speech to the American Conservative Union in which he said, conservatives, there are many of us, but we have this problem. There are two brands, or two, as we would say today, two camps among our conservatives. There are social conservatives who are concerned about the moral fiber of the country, and there are economic conservatives who want to lower taxes and diminish the government. And if we can federate, we can win. But if we don't federate, we won't win. He was exactly right, and he was, in effect, offering himself as the embodiment of that federation. And it was as that embodiment that, of course, he was elected in 1980, and the Republican Party became, to all intents and purposes, the vehicle of the movement. It became, the party became the incarnation of the conservative movement. Of course, his illegitimate son was George W. Bush. The Republicans have been adept for a long time at finding individuals who personify the sorts of imagery that appeals to the compound of voters that they need in order to create a majority. There's I think, a solid line connecting Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, George Bush. It at least can simulate being the rugged guy on the horse riding out of the Old West, the incarnation of individualist virtue and piety. In Reagan's case, he didn't actually have to be personally pious, but he could play it on TV. Bush may or may not be personally pious, but was able to play it all the more convincingly. So the Republican Party that has been in power as a result of what is, in effect, a usurpation of the year 2000, is the incarnation of a movement that appreciated just what it had to do in order to turn movement energies into the practical policies of a political party in power. And many of the abominations that we swim in today are the consequences of their doing exactly that, appointing their apostles to positions of power, whether in the intelligence services or in the regulatory agencies or the Department of the Interior, what have you, the Department of Justice, the implantation of political operatives in the domain of political power, of administrative power, is not just an accident. It's not a sign of some peculiar corruption to which the Bush administration is uniquely prone. It is actually the consequence of this movement party symbiosis which they achieved. And I speak of them as a bulldozer because it seems to me that they're bullish, not in the sense of optimistic, but in the sense of unthinking and stubborn and headlong approach to the world is not just their style, but it's of the essence of their ideology, of their nature. They are the party of will. George Bush is a man, I think, his biography, I think, matches this. The belief that, you can be nothing and accomplish everything by bulling ahead. You can fail upward, as they say in Hollywood, as an oil man on the strength of family fortune. You can, you don't need to hear the rest of it, you know that. So the bulldozer quality of this machine was able to be victorious in part because it controlled the institutions that made the usurpation possible. Here, the Supreme Court is the obvious case in 2000. But also because, on the other side, liberals, Democrats had not begun to try to solve the problem of the relation between their movements and their party. And this is partly because of the historical eruptions of the 1960s. And to make a long story short, the movements in which I participated, starting when I was here in the early 1960s, those movements were, in a sense, movements well, not very much in a very clear sense. Those were movements not against another party in power, but against our own party. And that was considerably so because of the enormous and abominable error that Lyndon Johnson made in inserting the United States so vigorously into Vietnam. The result was that instead of the movements of the 1960s, as might have been possible in the early 60s with the Civil Rights Movement, instead of that movement being a kind of sort of affirmative gadfly within the Democratic Party world, the movements counterposed themselves to the party from which most of these activists came. And there took place in 1968 a rupture. That rupture has taken decades to live past. I don't really want to take the time to go through the details of that. But suffice to say that the fragmentation of the movements of the 1960s, from a movement into movements, the proliferation of movements, in part because of the appeals of identity politics, in part because of the unwillingness of liberals to be disciplined about coming together within a single party, in part because of the anarchistic zeal of my generation in refusing to consider that there might be utility to power. Because to us, power was something wicked, and our mission as dissidents was to speak truth to it, but not to contaminate ourselves with it. And so facing the machinery, the bulldozer, that had no qualms about exercising power, that devoutly believed in it, that devoutly believed in hierarchy, we were defeated. In the 90s, there was, I think, a partial effort on the part of the post-60s movement to reconcile itself to power, and it took the perhaps implausible form of Bill Clinton, whose attempt to marry these modalities, the movement and the party, was largely a failure, although I think it was actually a well-intended effort. And into the vacuum marched the bulldozer, or rammed the bulldozer, which has been our fate for these awful years. Just briefly about where we are with respect to these terms now. One of the signs of reviving life in recent years has been, to my way of seeing, the return of a kind of movement spirit in the senses that I defined it earlier: amateur, principled, audacious, in some surprising forms and places, much of it in the form of what came to be called the netroots, who were, I think, widely misunderstood initially as liberals or left-wingers. But actually, they weren't, especially. Just as Howard Dean was no left-winger, one of their early leaders. If you read the interesting book by the two sort of bloggers in chief of the early phase, Marcos Melitsas and Drew Armstrong, a book called Crashing the Gates that came out in '05, I guess, you'll see that they begin, their very first chapter is a critique of identity politics. So this is not an attempt to redo the 60s. This is an attempt to infuse politics with the kind of direct appeal to citizen energies that can actually put movement and party in some kind of harmonious relationship to the other. For these people, tend to be young, that is to say, under 35. Power is not a dirty word. And activism is not something that you dress down necessarily to do. It simply it means the application of energy in a consolidated, in a cogent way, and the entry into the encrusted world of capital P politics by people who had felt themselves to be outsiders. And that has actually, I think, significantly transformed our political landscape and made it possible for the Democrats now to plausibly look for ways in which to harness the movement energy with the party vehicle. And it's so striking now that anybody who runs for president now has to sort of try to look hip, has to try to look electronically facile, skilled, adept. Not just look it, but actually be it. Because the party was moribund. I mean, it was a shock to me. I was working on my book when I discovered that in Ohio in 2004. I mean, you know about Ohio 2004. During that whole amazing campaign, the total number of staffers that the Democratic Party had working in Ohio, the National Democratic Party had, was 0. The Democratic Party did not exist as a political entity. So the Democrats have been playing this huge game of catch-up. That's what the Howard Dean 50-state idea during his tenure as chair of the Democratic National Committee is about. And the upshot is, I think, that there's nobody in the Democratic Party today who doesn't understand that the old vessels of the Democratic Party won't do the job of defeating the right-wing apparatus. So where are we now? Well, I mean, one way of describing the apparent logjam or standoff in the Democratic Party today is to say that we have two substantial candidates, each of whom in a different way represents movements of the liberal left, and they overlap, but they're not identical. And so the Democrats still have not come forward with a candidate who, as Reagan did and as Bush did, personifies both the important elements of their coalition. Bush was actually ideal because he was a plutocrat who was also a fundamentalist Christian. Democrats are more complicated than that, and Democrats have more lines of fissure to make up for. But Hillary Clinton, in a way, is the product of both the civil rights movement and the feminist movement of the 1960s, and Obama is, in a different way, a product of the civil rights movement because his candidacy was otherwise unimaginable, and he's also the candidate of the educated young, who either when they're young or when they grow a bit older amount to about 40% of the Democratic turnout. So the two of them draw on related but different strands, and neither of them is overwhelmingly able to crush the other. Of course, the advantage for the Democrats this time around is that they don't have a single figure who incarnates all their multiplicity either. Thus, the great conservative unhappiness that the incarnation of their desire has not walked on stage. I was reading Tom Paine earlier today, and I came across this in The Rights of Man. He wrote, "The new order of things has naturally followed the new order of thoughts." He wrote this in 1792, some of it while he was in prison in the Bastille awaiting execution for having offended the crazies in the French Revolution. The new order of thoughts. Is there a new order of thoughts? The ability to defeat the Republican bulldozer depends on, I think in part, on whether the energies which are, in the first instance, outsider energies, the energies of people who feel unfulfilled and intensely committed to a political transformation, are those energies emerging? Are they latent? Are they ready? Are they ready for something big? Or will we get, if the Democrats do win, yet another caretaker improvisation, a kind of scramble to keep footing while the bulldozer recaptures its momentum and readies for its next round? And that, I think, is the question that remains to be settled. And we have too little evidence for me to be confident right now. You know, some people are touting the big turnout in the various caucuses and primaries as a sign that the grassroots are vitalized, and you know, I don't want to over extrapolate from those. I do think, though, that both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are in some fashion aware of the kind of dynamic that I'm talking about here. And they have actually, it seems to be, somewhat different approaches to it. At least my guess is that when Barack Obama speaks the bipartisan lingo, and well, just an hour ago I saw a commercial that he's running here, which is in part coded in that lingo. It's his bring us together mode, one country mode. I suspect that this is actually a rather adroit maneuver to identify himself as the personification of the neglected American majority, or the big tent. In other words, I think the premise here is that George Bush so dramatically painted the Republican Party into a corner that there now is a potential epoch-making majority of the sort that could not only carry him to power, but also legitimize some significant transformations in areas like healthcare, foreign policy, and environmental policy. I don't believe that he is naive about everybody getting together and making nice, and I don't think anybody, even with his 10 or 12 years of experience in grown-up politics, is that naive. But I think his idea, his conception of the new order of thoughts is that the rejection of Bush that is so palpable in the land is convertible to a rejection not only of Bush, but of the politics that Bush represented, that Bush as the incarnation of the right-wing machine. Hillary Clinton's not capable, I think, constitutionally of sounding that note. She is not she doesn't have the eloquence, and she is already too branded a figure, too combative and scarred a figure to make a plausible run at presenting herself as the incarnation of the neglected unity, although on the strength of her record, it seems to me she's just as adroit as Barack Obama in actually accomplishing legislation in cooperation with people who were not Democrats. But I think rhetorically and maybe by instinct, her approach to the idea of the new order of thoughts is to sound some more traditional themes of democratic progressivism, and hope that the counter bulldozer can overcome all the baggage that she carries. I don't much like the prophecy game, so I'm going to leave it at that, and hope this at least instigated some queries. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you stay here. You're listening to the Cambridge Forum with Todd Gitlin, discussing recovering American ideals. It's my job to ask the first question. So here it is. I agree with you completely about what you say about the necessity of a movement working out its problem with the party. And I think you're absolutely right that you cannot really win elections and have anything like the majorities that the Republicans have had without doing that. And I agree with you as well that the Democrats have done much less of a job. But I would add a footnote. I think while it's absolutely necessary to win elections, to do exactly what you've described, the downside is that doing that makes it impossible to govern. That you can get power by doing what you've described, but you can't use it, and you can't use it effectively. I think you can see the proof of your thesis in the fact that over the last 6 or 7 years since Bush was elected, almost every significant vote that's come up in the House of Representatives or the Senate, the Republicans vote as a majority. In fact, actually they vote unanimously or close to unanimously, whereas the Democrats are always fractured. Now that should be an advantage in governing. Having that, you'll forgive the expression, but you know what I mean, having that sort of Leninist approach to politics where you're totally in agreement with each other and you can operate as what Lenin called an organizational weapon, that should make it easier for you to govern. But in fact, governance requires dissent. Governance requires disagreement. Governance requires people to consider possible alternatives. The worst thing you can do to govern is to be so damn sure that you're right that you bulldoze in a sense, as the Republicans have done in Iraq, as the Republicans have done with respect to Hurricane Katrina. So the very qualities of bulldozer politics and unanimous approach to politics that makes them so good at elections has made them absolutely disastrous as a governing party. So the one thing that I think needs to be added to your analysis is that while look how successful they are, I mean, George W. Bush is simply the most unpopular president in American history. There has never been a president that is ranked so low for so long and has essentially destroyed his party as he received it. Now, McCain is a surprise to everybody, and McCain could conceivably beat a Democrat, but McCain's not a movement conservative, as movement conservatives understand it. So the Bush's the very success of the Republicans in pursuing that kind of politics ultimately destroyed them as both a movement and as a party. Now, the price we've all paid as Americans for that is, of course, huge. But I did want to add at least one positive or more optimistic side to your analysis, that if you pursue that line that the Republicans have pursued, there is a price to be paid down the road. And the price is that, frankly, Americans do want a government that works. And when they get one that doesn't work, they express the levels of unpopularity that they've been expressing. So any comment on that?
Just that certainly you're pointing to what do we call euphemistically a challenge. But it may well be that the Republican catastrophe of the last few years, especially with the current economic turmoil, will be so palpably damaging to their prospects that the Republicans will have painted themselves into a corner, not only as a national party, but also as a congressional party. That is, it may be that the Democrats may find themselves able to muster supermajorities, especially in the Senate. And then so that's one thing that I think might very much transform the situation, so that the Democrats would not be stuck as they were in 1993 with an unusable majority that the Clintons then proceeded, or Bill Clinton proceeded basically to squander by applying the Democrats to the health care problem. There's a second thing that I'm at least sort of pragmatically hopeful about. Democrats have actually learned a lot in this process. I think Hillary Clinton has actually learned a lot, and I think both the way that both she and Barack Obama have approached the health care issue during the campaign suggests to me that what they understand they have to do is to come up with a proposal that, in a sense, it's the pre-negotiated solution to the problem. That is, I mean, if you go back to 1993, Clinton came in with, Hillary came in with this plan nobody could understand. There were, I believe, 100 members of the House who wanted single payer and tried to stop their thing because it wasn't single payer. And then there were another, I think, 60 what we would now call blue dog Democrats, led by Jim Cooper of Tennessee, who thought that Hillary's plan was socialized medicine and went too far. I think that what the various versions that the two of them have brought forward now reflect the sort of pre-shaken version of a version of legislation that I think could overcome those centrifugal dangers, but I think they would continue to be real. And by the way, we haven't talked about foreign policy, but I would expect it's not going to be a picnic to be president of the United States after George W. Bush, and there will be vigorous fights about what to do about all kinds of real and unimagined threats. So stay tuned.
Just one quick response before I turn it over to you. I'm curious about the way history is going to judge George W. Bush and his relationship to the Republican Party. Because it seems to me that if George Bush were a movement conservative, first of all, he never would have picked Dick Cheney as his vice president, either in 2000 or even much more likely in 2004. He would have groomed a successor. Imagine, for example, if Mike Huckabee, who was then governor of Arkansas, had been chosen, Cheney had been dumped, and Huckabee had been chosen in 2004, the Republicans now would be completely unified. The next person would be ready to take office. Bush is not a party builder. I think you're absolutely right that he fits the script so well for blending these Republican themes, but he himself and Vice President Cheney have never really put building the Republican Party first. Well,
I think some political scientists would say no modern president has actually done much of that. Reagan didn't do it either. He betrayed his movement conservatives with George H.W. Bush, who they saw as an alien.
Yeah. Anyway, please come up to the microphone.
Hi, I'm going to ask you the question that I suspect you wanted to avoid, which is which of the two Democratic candidates do you think is more able to bring the people together in a way that they can take the White House this year?
I don't want to avoid it, but I've fretted a great deal about that. A couple weeks ago, the New Republic asked me and Alan, actually, to express our sentiments. And when I wrote I said, well, I haven't made up my mind. And they said, well, say that. So I did. And I think it came out last Friday.
Yeah, you're so happy.
Well, I was teetering because I saw apples on one side and oranges on another, and they didn't add up. Now, by the time that piece came out, I had already been tilted over, and I have now cast my absentee ballot in New York for Barack Obama. But it's not because I think this is simple, and I think still the odds of his getting the nomination are less than 50-50. But I finally was overpowered by the formidable and undeviating percentages of independents who can't abide Hillary Clinton. It does not move. That number does not move over time. And I'm here thinking about the overwhelming importance of winning. For all that you can say about what happens to white voters entering the ballot box, entering the voting booth, I still think that he has a better chance. He's extremely adroit. He's playing this very well, and he doesn't have a lot of the baggage. So I confess, also viscerally repelled by some of the Clinton maneuvers of the last 10 days, and that, where my mind had made up, but my viscera hadn't followed. My viscera piled on, and that meant I made my decision without ambivalence.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to raise and explore what I take as the primary theme of your book, which is the relationship between a party and a movement. I'm concerned that if Barack Obama or Clinton should win, we won't see the kind of progress that we need to achieve given the enormity of our problems. The term progressive has been used so flexibly now in the last 5 to 10 years that I'm afraid, as you pointed out in your book, when you talked about the activists, the pro-Kerry activists in Pennsylvania, who said, if Kerry wins, I'm going to go back to my life. I'm going to remove myself from politics because we have won. And I'm really concerned that the progressives many progressives will take the same attitude if Clinton or Obama should win, number one. And number two, as of now, there doesn't seem to be an organized left out there that can draw Obama or Clinton to the left. The progressive movement, as it's now constituted, is so amorphous that I'm not confident that there's anything there that, as of now at least, can really draw either of those people to the left should they win. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how the left might be able to reconstitute itself so that if either of those candidates win, we could see some forward motion or leftward motion.
Okay, just rushing through a big tangle of questions here. I think not always in history, but in America and in this period, movements are amorphous. The right as well as the left. Well, the right, we're against government. What does that mean? Against government? Please. We're for values. Anybody in this room against values? Families? Anybody really got it in for family? Amorphousness, that is to say, literally the absence of shape, is part of what movements do, because movements are oceanic movements of energy and desire, and often they don't know what they want until somebody names it. You can see, Obama has explicitly said he doesn't want to use 60s language. And then sometimes he's using this other, sometimes he seems to be ventriloquizing David Broder about bipartisanship, but I can't believe he really means that either. I think that he's fishing. I think if he is the nominee, we'll see we'll see a series of endeavors in which he'll try on different sorts of languages and maybe something will click. Bill Clinton did too, by the way. Bill Clinton started his presidency with talk about a new covenant, and then he banned, none of it sang. I think Obama's got a reasonable chance of finding the right lyric. The other thing that I feel is auspicious about Obama is, and this is an empirical observation. A lot of people have pointed out he excites young people. That's not just gravy in the campaign. If you can excite people, the excitement of people is a resource, and it is a necessary resource. It's absolutely a necessary condition for a significant political change. It's not a sufficient condition, but because in order to get significant political change, you not only have to decide what programs you're pushing for, but you actually have to threaten to roll over politicians who resist, as Johnson could do with his landslide in 1964 on civil rights and on the other Great Society programs. You actually have to. You actually have to get people worked up, and John Kerry couldn't do it. Obama might be able to. So much is now projected onto him. Any political leader is in part a projective screen. And so much now is being projected onto him as to turn him willy-nilly into a vehicle to some yet unnamed collective purpose. By the way, in this, he very closely resembles John F. Kennedy, who did not run for president in 1960 on the basis of a clear anything. He ran against the missile gap, which was a fantasy. He was for vigor and for newness and blah blah, and it wasn't much there. Those are some of the weird dynamics of presidential politics.
Mr. Gitlin, thank you for being here. I'm part of that young generation that's in some ways gotten more, young movement energy that's gotten more behind people like Dean and Obama. What I worry about is if we can get those people in the place, in terms of America as a cultural landscape, these people, once we get them to the top, are not going to have that much room to go that much to the left, significantly to the left. And as someone who I know cares about significant leftward shift, I'm just curious, you brought up Tom Paine, and you seem to be in some ways referring to culture as a force. What about, you can make the argument on a very superficial level, please forgive me, that, in some ways primetime TV has done more for gay rights, and Inconvenient Truth has done more for environmental issues than a lot of youth movement, traditional youth movement work. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on youth and being more involved as cultural warriors in terms of pressing those ideas and changing the kind of the landscape culturally in the public, so that once we do have that leader, they have the room to push things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Here's something between a belief and a wish. I think Obama wants, I think Hillary too, actually, wants a vast popular uprising in behalf of green politics. I think they are equally astute, that is to say, their eyes are equally open about not only the consequences of continued greenhouse garbaging, but also the economic necessity of creating a government prodded new technology sector as a source of jobs growth, and therefore as something toward an economic post-New Deal political economy. I think I'm reliably informed that two things had to happen before Barack Obama decided to run last December. The first was he was waiting to see how Harold Ford did in the race in Tennessee. And contrary to a lot of the muttering that was going on after Iowa and New Hampshire, Obama observed that Ford actually did better on Election Day than he'd been doing in the polls in the run-up. And Ford ended up losing by 3 points, but he was running 6-7 points behind. So in other words, he had to assure himself that the Tom Bradley effect, white people say piously saying, yeah, they'll vote for a black guy, but then not doing it, that was at least not a sure thing. The second thing he had to do was to assure himself that Al Gore was not going to run. And he went to, I'm told, he and his wife went to Tennessee and spent a day with the Gores and satisfied themselves that Gore was not going to run. I think that he must understand that the Al Gore view of the world is not a sci-fi fantasy. I think he must take it seriously. So it wouldn't surprise me, because also he makes noises about national service and so on, that we might find ourselves I hope we find ourselves, whoever the president turns out to be, find ourselves in a position where there will need to be, some, million green person march, those are old forms. I'm not beholden to those forms, but some sort of creative manifestation of popular will that will absolutely contain and crush the refusal to face environmental reality. And I think either Obama, and the ability to mobilize if there's one issue that young people actually do more than give lip service to, it's the environment. So I think that's in the works. I hope so. It had better be.
Thank you for being here this evening, Mr. Gitlin. It's good to see everyone, talk to you guys. So I would like to, you've been talking a lot about like Barack and Hillary and the party side of all of this. I would like to, perhaps if you could talk a little bit more about the movement side of it. And I'm part of like the new Students for Democratic Society. We think and talk a lot about you guys in the old days. So, but it is and I mean, the new left, whatever we call ourselves. And I don't think there's like a we essentially maybe for the new left. But what would it, if we go back to like 68, you said it like in that year there's this sort of like critical collapse. There was the movement, the party for like the left and liberal politics in America never made this critical connection. If you could try to bring back some of this radical imagination that you had in the 60s and reimagine what would have a successful party movement link looked like in the 60s, and more importantly, what would it look like for now? Meaning, like, what can we draw upon? What can we learn? One of the most powerful things about this entire presidential race for me has been seeing that, I mean, we have a major candidate, a female candidate and a person of color. I mean, you say that like Barack doesn't want to talk about the 60s, but of course he draws upon like King and Malcolm and all these different elements. I mean, this is a very powerful, to me, intergenerational thing. So I just appreciate learning from this and also like seeing how we can like sort of reimagine how the left is going to help out. Not just how Barack and Hillary are going to manipulate things, but what can the young left be doing to be moving this forward and be talking about like not just healthcare reform, not just pulling out of Iraq, but like, anti-imperialism and really getting at the heart of like the material injustices in this country. So I know this is sort of incoherent ramblings, but
No,
I appreciate hearing this.
It's very coherent rambling.
Right.
I appreciate your posing this. Here's how I understand, and even at the time, how I understood the New Left. We were, on the one hand, moralists, outsiders, amateurs, those principled, inflexible sort of people. And we were also analytically, at least we made an attempt to be analytically clear-headed. So while we had friendly relations with people who were quite uncompromising in their style, in their tactics, people like nuclear pacifists who tried to disrupt the launching of nuclear submarines. There was a small movement of such people. We admired them and we talked with them, but we were not them. What was the difference? The difference was that we regarded ourselves as strategists. And we were. Even though John Kennedy was not a civil rights crusader by any means, the great acceleration in the civil rights movement takes place while he's president, not because anybody had any illusions about it, but because there was an understanding that he politically was observant, he was attentive, he was attuned to what the movement was doing, and draggable along by it. So by the way, deals were made. I mean, the civil rights movement agreed, never quite publicly said it, but around 1962, even the most militant figures in the civil rights movement, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, agreed pretty much at the behest of Bobby Kennedy, who was then Attorney General, to subtract energy from the direct action confrontations and to move that energy into voter registration campaigns, because they understood that's where the future was. And that was actually quite prophetic and important, and eventually led to the Mississippi crisis in '64 and the voting rights achievement. So all this is to say that we were trying to be both idealists and practical. I mean, I think that's a good idea. Now, the landscape today is vastly different than it was then. I mean, we presupposed a liberal center. And we were living in an America in which, the right wing were a bunch of kooks in Orange County. And the John Birch Society was some maniacs. And there were 12 of them. And Dwight Eisenhower might have been a Democrat. And all that was true. And in fact, he was a Republican who thundered against the military-industrial complex. The political landscape today, you guys need to size up. And I hope you size it up the way I size it up. The way I size it up is to say that the overriding priority is to drive the movement conservatives to the margin of American political life, to defeat them badly, to cripple them. And in having our ability to do that is the absolute prerequisite of either of two important things and necessary things. One is to actually achieve reforms that we really need. I mean, this thing about global warming isn't a pipe dream. You know, the spread of nuclear weapons is not something that anybody dreamed up. And the energies that are mobilized in order to accomplish reforms also then spill over. And then other things become possible, because then then if the center lurches to the left, then politicians start realizing that all manner of things might be possible that they hadn't taken into consideration. So I put it to you guys, what else you got?
And to cripple the conservatives.
Yeah. I mean, wouldn't that be a noble thing to do? Wouldn't that be a truly epic-making thing to do?
Well, I mean, if I can speak, I just...
Fine with me.
When you read the Port Huron statement, one of the first things that you guys do is talk about values, and you articulate this very coherent, very optimistic, very much in the sort of like Emersonian tradition of like, and all these good American folks of a human nature and a very positive view of human nature. And this idea, you're right, there was a liberal center presupposed, but it was also presupposed that if we could only remove these blemishes and these corruptions, it would reveal this sort of like glorious, liberated human being. And I feel like, and I don't want to say that like, whatever, like the shatterings of postmodernism have caused all the angst of like the young left today. I don't think that. But when you read the documents of SDS today, like on the SDS wiki, I don't think there will ever be like a one Port Huron statement of my generation, but there are many like key documents that sum up what we think. The language is much more about these, I think it's like, they phrase it like interlocking systems of oppression. And that, I don't know the answer to this, but there's something frustrating and disappointing in fighting a system of interlocking oppressions and forever saying the best thing we can do is cut them down at their knees. And I don't know what is left, because I think for you guys it felt good to know. In the 1930s it felt good to know for the American communist. But like the young left today, we know racism is wrong, we know classism is wrong, and we will fight against these things, But there's not this coherent center positive vision of human nature. Was that a mistake? Was that some sort of, I don't understand, like, you're making this different argument today. Is it just a difference of political landscape?
That statement of values that begins the Port Huron statement, we hold human beings to be infinitely precious, and so on and so on. That was probably the smartest thing that the post-Port Huron group did when they were editing the document was to move that section up front. And they had, I say they because I wasn't part of that inner circle, although I loved the document when I read it. They, I think, felt what you rightly characterize as the desire to put something forward which wasn't simply an exclamation of revulsion, that they wanted to be something other than a shoe thrown into the machines of unstoppable oppression or something. I mean, they wanted to express an American ideal. And that was extremely valuable. extremely valuable because, criticism, especially now, but I mean, it was true even then, criticism's a dime a dozen. I mean, Americans are great critics, or one might say whiners. So who's content? We're not a happy country, and that's partly because of economic uncertainty, but it's also because we're overstuffed and we're morally decentered or empty, and I think that criticism is true, and I do think that the left has some. I've argued in a previous book that it's a lot easier to find out what the left despises on a university campus than to see it standing for something that actually makes you feel good rather than more enraged, and politics in the long run, is made on people's sense of attachment to a possibility rather than simple revulsion. Because there are many ways of living, a fat and happy life in revolt in overstuffed America. But I don't propose that you repeat the vocabulary of the Port Huron Statement or something. I think the exercise of trying to formulate a set of values that you can stand for is an important exercise. And if you've tried it and failed to do it, I'd say go back and try harder. Because if you can't do that, then you're not a movement. Then you are some groups. But you're a series of limbs in search of a heart.
Exactly. Thank you.
Why don't we take the next two questions one after each other and then give you a chance to respond. Thank you for waiting patiently.
Okay. I asked Barack Obama a question if he would wear the full mantle of Martin Luther King into the White House up in New Hampshire, which is one of the great treats about living up there because the whole world comes to your doorstep and it brings the mountain to Muhammad, so to speak. And his answer was in typical politician's parlance. He said, I will move it forward, which is a way of saying absolutely nothing. So I didn't vote for him because of that, because I said in front of 2,000 people, I will vote for you today if you say yes in answer to this question. And don't you think that classism is greater than racism as a battleground in this country, and that the glass ceiling needs to be punctured because women have been oppressed in that way for over 10 millennia of time, and blacks were only enslaved in this country maybe for 250 years. And the other issue I have is that you say that in a self-deprecating way that the left didn't have power, but isn't the power of one greater than the many, greater than that of George Bush, as one native chieftain said to me, witnessed the lone protester at Tiananmen Square in front of the bulldozers. And when you talk about individual virtue and piety of John Wayne types and Reagan and so forth, isn't it really a masquerade for hegemony as a handmaiden to xenophobia and pure raw selfish greed and power grabs? And while Salman Rushdie didn't have any trouble with me, he made it all into one big question there when I talked to him last month when he was here. So isn't it really about fear versus love and the human condition, which was a segue to the last comment you just made? That and if you didn't have power, why was the FBI? Why was the Black Panthers and SDS and all the forces of politics were trying to crush them if there was no power? And if voting really mattered, wouldn't it be outlawed? And as Stokely Carmichael said to me, Martin Luther King was very much a politician and worked in the halls of power. And whereas Stokely Carmichael kept things stirred up out in the country, out in the kitchen, kept the heat in the pot stirred up down below. So
we've got a couple more people waiting. Would you mind?
Okay, could you tackle that much anyway? Thank you.
So let's have the last two people ask both of you ask your questions, then we have to ask Todd to respond and bring it to a close. Yeah.
Thank you for being here tonight. As I think about one of your opening comments, which was that the conservative movement federated two factions, one which was dedicated to the reduction of government and essentially taxes, the tax burden, and the other social positions. I think that in the last 40 years, I've seen a steady procession of conservative candidates being elected, taking positions on social issues that are really contrary to at least what the polls show the American electorate believes on several significant issues like reproduction rights, like health care, and there are a plethora of those kinds of issues that it seems they're running contrary to what the American electorate wants, and they win. Which leads me to the conclusion that the real federation the part of the federation that's been effective for them is the one that has reduced that part down to a very simple message, which is reducing taxes. It's an easy, digestible, clear message that anyone can see the effect on themselves. And if they want to think about other people, they can look at the other people who are getting tax rebates and say it's good for them as well. My despair is that I don't think it's possible for the left to somehow fabricate a message which is as clearly effective as the reduction of taxes is. I was part of the Dean movement. I was an early supporter of Dean. And if you consider what happened during his campaign, besides all of his foibles and things that he said inappropriately, the only major policy shift that campaign had was to back off of their pledge, or Dean's pledge, to roll back the Bush tax cut in entirety. And that was because of pressure from within the Democratic Party. And so when I see someone like Dean even move back on the issue of taxes, it worries me that the left will never be able to come up with a message which is as simple and as digestible and as effective as reducing taxes. And this particularly in a country where we have, I believe, the lowest tax burden among all developed countries in the world. So I wonder if you would have some comments as to where you might see somehow a synthesis of a simple message that could carry us forward in moving on to these other issues that we all feel are so important. Thanks.
Again, if you could please just keep your remarks short, because people are starting to peter out, and I'd like to have a more coherent group.
So I'd like to reiterate this gentleman's question and express my disappointment that the name of Milton Friedman didn't come up, and that it seems to me that the synthesis of the right is privatization, laissez-faire capitalism, and this shrinking the government. And I think it seems to me that the kind of leadership that you're implicitly suggesting or advocating is based largely on resentment, which is a sociological term, which is anger at the other side. And I think what we need is a plan. And I think the plan is nonprofit, antitrust moves against big corporations, and nonprofit development of the renewable energy sector and the health sector. Thank you.
And the last comment, please keep it short. Thank you.
Okay, this is a little bit related to the last comment. It has to do with corporations. It seems to me that's the big elephant in the room that hasn't been talked about. The giant military corporations like Lockheed Martin, like Disney in media, like the big pharma, like the big food corporations and so forth. Neither of these candidates, or none of the three candidates that we've been talking about here, seem to be interested at all in challenging corporate power. And I'm wondering whether, particularly because of the big media, the movements don't seem to be challenging big corporate power either, which is like operating full steam in the basement.
Okay, here's my best mix of these ingredients. The man who stood in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square was a great unknown hero. And what is it, 18 years later, 19 years later, the Communist Party of China is very successful. It's in power. I honor that man. But he didn't know when he stood in front of that tank what it was going to do. But what it did was to create a symbolic expression and not to create counterpower. Obama has been a community organizer. I've spent a little time as a community organizer. What does a community organizer do? A community organizer is different from a mobilizer. A mobilizer is Martin Luther King. His voice swells and you feel yourself breathe in the spirit and you're ready to march. He was organized by community organizers as a preacher to join their movement, which they had begun, the Montgomery bus boycott. The community organizer is working with on-the-ground actual people and is only able to convince them to keep coming around if he delivers the goods. They have to see that something practical comes of it. So he can do some King cadences, and he's quite good at it. I mean, he's quite wonderful at it. But that's not who he is, and that's fine. That's fine. His ability as a practical politician to also play that music is a great and useful and maybe necessary additional skill. But Martin Luther King didn't contest elections, didn't have to win elections. But Lyndon Johnson, as Hillary Clinton said, did. And we need that. The lack of a simple message. I think maybe Obama is flirting with it with this refrain that he's been using recently, very simple, yes we can, which is, some people say, well, he's trying to sound like Cesar Chavez. Si se puede. He's hoping, the Spanish speakers in California pick up on this. I wonder if he might not actually be signaling something else. Signaling that in order to actually accomplish necessary reforms, there needs to be a functional we. There needs to be a political entity, and that it can't be done, that the changes that must be done cannot be done by Big Pharma, which has other fish to fry, cannot be done by Big Oil, which has other fish to fry. So yes, we can is a way of saying we are the government. We need a government that actually accomplishes what people need. And maybe that's good enough, because resentment is also a very powerful factor in politics. If the Democrats run a campaign that doesn't try to saddle whoever the Republican nominee with every jot of the Bush record, then they deserve nothing but ignominious defeat. The Republican disaster is such that resentment is who is sentient does not resent what these people have done to this country and to the world. I mean, and this is Newt Gingrich said it, when was it, a year ago or so? He said, the Democratic slogan is, had enough? Sounds good to me. I mean, had enough. Finally, about pharma and oil, I think, give both Obama and Hillary Clinton some credit here. They, I think, are very well aware. They would have to be very well aware of the power of corporations in politics. And they have decided to do an end run around it. Instead of campaigning to increase, say, corporate taxes or soaking the rich or something like that, they are, I think, hoping to sort of run around the side by talking a different sort of language. But Hillary Clinton is well aware that, through her experience, that if you don't split the medical pharmaceutical complex, you can't achieve health care. So she's, flirting with ways to do that. Obama did it in his way. They both must be acutely aware of the stakes that these corporations have in the ecological energy status quo. And it'll be an interesting thing to see how they try to pull it off and how ugly those guys get in resisting, because they will resist. And I think the ploy has to be, the people are united in what they want, and you other guys get out of the way, or General Motors will sink beneath the waves of Toyota because it can no longer pay the health care of its workers. That was a case the Clintons tried to make in '93. It wasn't strong enough. Now, 15 years later, General Motors gets the point, and I think they think that the voters will too. So I think the reform happens inadvertently and behind our backs. I wouldn't get too distressed by the tenor of the campaign and its failure to rise to our passionate desires. Franklin Roosevelt ran for president in 1932 on a platform of balancing the budget. What you want is a president who is attuned to the changing configuration of forces. And if the changing configuration of forces manifests itself in behalf of progressive reform, I think very interesting things will begin to move in this country, and we might produce a different landscape. Thanks a lot.